And I am here with one of my favourite politicians in the whole world, and that is Senator Ronan Mullen.
Thank you very much, Roisin.
Senator Ronan Mullen, you have been a hero to many women and child here in Ireland, especially coming up to the referendum. And also you have been a great advocate and a staunch leader in free speech here in Ireland. I met you last year and have a great photograph of you with you at the event in Trinity College where Michael Schillenberger came over,
I remember that.
Andy NGO, and Andrew Doyle. So that was a real big event.
It was, and I think what we all share in common, none of us likes hate speech. None of us wants a culture that is dominated or driven by hate speech. We can all accept that there's some really toxic stuff, it's online, and it is the Wild West in many ways. But there are ways to try and influence human behaviour, to get people treating each other with love and respect, to conduct debates on important issues and on sensitive issues civilly. What you do not do is you don't put people under the threat of the criminal law for speaking their minds, even on controversial issues, unless it's very clear and obvious that they're imposing, doing something harmful to society or endangering on other people. There are, of course, situations where you can criminalise forms of speech that directly endanger other people. If I shout fire in a theatre, or any number of things, or if I, encourage violence towards other people, that has to be, that's what criminal law is for. But it is not for regulating public debate or keeping people polite when they go online. I wish people would be polite when they go online, but I don't want to use the criminal law to force them. I'd rather we use the education system. I'd rather our churches were able to influence people towards, Christian, to use a word that we can impose more widely or propose more widely, but that people would deal with people in a manner that was always called the Christian way to deal with people because of Ireland's Christian culture, or to deal with people with the respect that we all deserve because of our human dignity, whatever situation we're in. But I hope now with the talk that this hate speech legislation is going to come back in some form. I think one thing we have to really look out for here is the government saying we're doing this because we need to be in compliance with a particular EU decision. I know the EU decision they're talking about. It was tacked to the back of the legislation last year on the so-called hate speech, incitement to violence or hatred legislation. What is very clear is that the legislation that the government was proposing last year went much further than what that EU decision was requiring. And if they were only doing what the EU decision was requiring, I don't think we would have very much controversy. But it is that they're taking an inch, or getting an inch, and taking a yard, and trying to create certain kinds of restrictions on free speech by, for example, not defining terms such as hate or hatred, so that those terms could be misused. And of course, we have this strange definition of gender, which they did introduce into the residual part of the law they brought in around hate offences. And now I see that definition of gender, which means anything you want it to mean. It's not the distinction between male and female anymore. That has now crept its way into the forthcoming broadcasting legislation, despite a commitment that they gave that definition was only for that particular piece of legislation. So what you have again is people behind the scenes, possibly under the influence of NGOs, certainly people whose names we don't know, who seem to be driving agendas within government departments, so that you see this weird and dangerous definition of gender, which is tendentious, which is politicized, which is about eliminating the distinction, the evidence-based distinction that is there between men and women. It's disquieting to see that weird definition suddenly pop up in another piece of legislation, and I think we need to challenge government on that.
And an indoctrination of children as well, and confusing children. Let children be children.
Let children be children. And I think this is why, for example, among others, the Catholic Primary School Managers Association pushed back a few years ago against the emerging development in the curriculum, which was basically saying that gender is just a spectrum, and that the curriculum people pulled in their horns slightly on that, but they're still there with those kind of thoughts and tendencies. And I hope that, the likes of the CPSMA and others, and especially parents, would be aware, that the people who are shaping our curriculum are not necessarily friends of common sense. They're not necessarily friends of letting children be children, and they sometimes allow agendas such as the early sexualization of children to find its way into the type of themes and talk that they're pushing in the curriculum. And we need to push back on that. And one way to push back on that is to emphasize that parents must be consulted, and really you can't be saying that children have the right, or parents have the right, to take their children out of a particular class if they don't like it. That's putting all the onus on the parent to make their child the odd person out. That is wrong. Parents need to be consulted, and there needs to be a clear understanding that the curriculum is not something to be imposed on on communities, on schools, but it is actually something that has to reflect the values of the school in question, its ethos for which it's set up, which everybody knows about, which people freely accept when they send their children to that school, and with full knowledge and consultation with parents about the material that's going to be used. And I think as well, many teachers are uncomfortable about being asked to teach and talk about stuff that simply isn't age appropriate. I get the argument that says, children are coming across all sorts of stuff and toxic stuff in relation to sexuality online. But you can't address that by putting the blinkers on parents and not being upfront with parents about what you want discussed in the schools. There has to be much more free and frank discussion. And I would encourage parents who are concerned about this issue, be there to go to those meetings with schools, be available to go on boards of management, ask and insist on being told what exactly is being taught in the curriculum, how it's going to be taught. Ask to see the textbooks that are being come into the school. Some textbooks that I've seen are just simply inappropriate with some of the content that's in them. So people are right to push back, and must push back in a very insistent way. And I think there'll be many people who will support those concerns.
And it's even in the media, that the media are not even calling out the government or other politicians to account on the gender ideology and women's spaces and women's sports and children's sports.
Yes, well, there was an excellent article by Hugh Linehan in the Irish Times in the last couple of days, and an equally excellent letter in the Irish Times today from Stella O'Malley, who just bringing her core professionalism and truth-telling and evidence-based approach to this issue, has been a very important voice for, I suppose, promoting ways of dealing with gender dysphoria, with children who are gender distressed, that doesn't involve putting them down the pathway of dangerous chemical, hormonal, and eventually surgical interventions. I mean, that isn't an ideological perspective. That is an evidence-based person-centered approach. And yes, you're right, the media has been horrendously bad on this, especially RTE, which is really, has operated a very narrow and selective agenda, which is not appropriate for a publicly funded broadcaster. Credit to Hugh Linehan for at least acknowledging this issue and bringing it to light in the Irish Times. And hopefully, though, that won't be a once-off intervention. Hopefully there can be a rethink, and we need to press the restart button on how some of these issues are being discussed.
Senator Ronan Mullen, my favourite politician, along with the others.
Very bad.
You have been such a great advocate for women, and especially with everything that's happened over the last couple of years. I'd like to thank you personally from my heart. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Count on my efforts. I don't know. I can't say I'm always right, but I'll always try and get it right as far as I can. So Mila Buick is.
Well, no one's always right.
That's true.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.